started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexandra Konofsky, one of our acquisitions editors for Oxford Intersections at OUP. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual workshop on crafting strong interdisciplinary abstracts. This workshop is hosted by Oxford Intersections, a new home for original peer-reviewed interdisciplinary research. First, a little housekeeping. Portions of this workshop will be recorded, but the recording will be shared with all registrants afterwards. We will be utilizing breakout rooms, which will be randomly assigned to with one of our Oxford Intersections editors. You will not have to do anything on your side to enter the breakout room. The breakout room portion of the workshop will not be recorded. On the right side of the screen, you can see tabs for the chat and the Q&A. You can use the chat tab to share your thoughts, but please make sure you are putting questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll try to answer them at the end if the time permits. You'll also see a tab for handouts, where we've put a worksheet you can download to work on your abstract, along with more information about Oxford Intersections and how you can get involved. As I mentioned, I'm Alexandra Konofsky, and I will be joined in a bit by my colleague Sam Bailey, Senior Associate Editor for Oxford Intersections at OUP. We're thrilled to have with us 4 editors from the Oxford Intersections project to serve as abstract advisors today. With us, we have Madeline Detloff, General Editor of the Gender Justice Oxford Intersection, Talia Esnard, Section Editor for Gender Justice, Joshua Hagan, co-general editor of the Borders Oxford Intersection, and Adeline Johns-Putra, advisory board member and co-section editor of the Climate Adaptation Intersection. They'll each be leading one of the 4 breakout rooms, accompanied by some OUP staff for support. Here's what you can expect during our section today. We'll soon kick things off with an instructional segment from my colleague on what makes a good interdisciplinary abstract. After this, we will randomly assign participants to breakout rooms where you'll get personalized feedback on your draft abstract from Oxford Intersections editors. A reminder that we do require participation for the breakout room section of this workshop. Please be prepared to share your abstract either via screen sharing or pasting text in the breakout room when the time comes. Finally, we'll bring everyone back together to the main workshop room to answer any questions that came in via the Q&A tab or share any thoughts from our advisors that came up during the breakout room section. Our hope is that by the end of the workshop, you'll feel armed with the tools to create a strong interdisciplinary abstract for submission to any kind of outlet, and possibly Oxford Intersections in the future. Now, I'll pass things along to my colleague, Sam Bailey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Alexandra. My name is Sam, and in my capacity as Senior Associate Editor at OUP, I commission research for various Oxford Intersections projects, including Gender Justice with Madeline and Talia, who are with us today, Racism by Context, and Environmental Change and Human Experience. Before this, I also completed a PhD in French and Disability Studies about 5 years ago, so I have experience of both writing abstracts as a researcher and receiving and assessing them as a publisher. So I'm going to begin with some really basic points about what an abstract is trying to achieve that we need to bear in mind whenever we're writing one. So I tend to think of an abstract a bit like a movie trailer. It is a concise overview, usually of around 150 to 300 words, that helps potential readers decide if they want to read your work. And in order to do this, it must set the scene for your research paper, it must summarize the contents of that paper, and forecast some of the key conclusions. And this abstract will usually be your reader's first interaction with your paper, so you must really write it with that in mind. So it should be intelligible on its own without the reader really needing to have read your whole paper or have in-depth knowledge of the subject at hand. So with those basic points in mind, I'm going to go forward to talk about what makes a good abstract. So I think you have to remember that people won't read what they consider to be irrelevant or uninteresting. So abstracts, first of all, must have a hook. And that is, by that I mean it must prioritize the most exciting thing about your research and really champion that exciting notion that you're going to put forward in your paper to leave readers wanting to find out more. And I think that generally speaking, most successful abstracts will follow a format like what you see on the screen. I will caveat that with, I know various disciplines will have different norms, but I think if we take sort of the most basic series of concepts and functions of an abstract, this tends to be what we see. So first of all, we'll have some background or some context. And in this section, usually towards the top of the abstract, you will need to set up the research topic or the problem that your paper is going to deal with. And yeah, I think you should really state the research question in explicit terms. You can say the aim of this paper is to, or the research question this paper answers is, and like really make it very, very explicit that your paper is going to address this problem or this question. And then I think I've put in quite a large box the idea of needing to clarify why it is important to answer this research question. So that is the reason. Why are you doing this to begin with? Afterwards, I think it's important, especially for interdisciplinary research, to briefly describe your methods or your approach. This is because in interdisciplinary papers, you will likely be using a combination of approaches from multiple disciplines. And I know that not all disciplines will have a formal methodology section in their papers. This can be really as simple as, for example, this paper uses a Marxist feminist critical apparatus to analyze its primary texts because. I think it's also important to say why you're using this method. What about this method is particularly appropriate for the research question or questions at hand? Then after you've done that, I think I would tend to advise you to summarize or forecast some of your key findings. You'll see some abstracts that don't do this because authors prefer to keep their findings back for the conclusion of their paper. This is okay, but I think my advice would be to at least forecast them in the abstract. One of the reasons for this is that lots of scholars coming into contact with your research will only read the abstract. And if you put a summary of your paper's findings in there, that might be just enough to incite them to read on. And you might therefore get a citation out of it or some interesting scholarly conversations. But if you don't forecast your findings or your results of the abstract, you might not get that. So that's just my recommendation. And then finally, I think it's important to have a concluding sentence or two. And this sentence needs to explain the significance or impact of the research. I tend to phrase this along the lines of, so what? Why should anyone care? And this is usually where the hook comes, where you state the largest, most exciting outcome of your research. I think also I want to say that these elements should not necessarily always be in this order, though this is my recommended order. For example, I've seen some successful abstracts that begin with the question, for example. That's okay. I think that works sometimes. Other abstracts might move the so what part, so the conclusion or implications, right to the top. So in that sense, they start with the most exciting implications of their research findings. That can also work. So do feel free to play around with the order, so long as I think the different elements still flow into one another and support one another in a logical way. But I think so long as these elements are there, you're probably on the right track. But you can reorder them if you want. I'm now going to talk briefly about some specific advice about interdisciplinary publications and abstracts for interdisciplinary papers. I think it's important to recognize that abstracts for interdisciplinary research papers have more work to do than abstracts for papers that sit squarely within one discipline. You must assume little to no specialist foreknowledge because your paper is being pitched to researchers from outside of your core discipline. And the risk here is that when you're dealing with so many varied interpretive frameworks to tie together separate strands of disciplinary scholarship, you risk losing a lot of your readers along the way. And this is because they may only be familiar with one or two of those frameworks or contexts. So my advice is this, that the background and methodology points are particularly important in interdisciplinary abstracts. So I think you should take a couple of extra sentences to really contextualize your own unique scholarly intervention and explain your interdisciplinary methodology or theoretical framework. And vitally, this includes any key pieces of disciplinary terminology. And you should also say why this interdisciplinary approach is appropriate for this kind of research. It's also important to put forward some background information. What does the reader need to know from the various disciplines with which you're engaging in order to be able to follow your paper? Again, this can be as basic as summarize a really key development in a particular field that you are sort of porting over and applying to some research in a different field. I'd also advise you to say something along what are the advantages of an interdisciplinary approach to the problem at hand? So what does your interdisciplinary approach add that a single discipline approach might lack? So as well as previewing your research, you sort of need to explain and defend its interdisciplinariness. I don't really have a better way of putting it than that, but my advice is to do that in those two sections I've highlighted, the background context section right at the top, and then the method section near the bottom. That's really where you need to explain why the interdisciplinary approach is necessary and why this is really the only way of appropriately tackling the problem at hand and answering the question. So that is the end of my kind of like generic advice. And we're now going to go into some individual rooms for the hands-on portion of this workshop.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I think hopefully we should have gotten everyone back from all of the various breakout rooms. I hope you all had very full discussions. I would request you all, if you start having some questions that you want to think about, to put those in the Q&A tab now. But before we start with the questions, I wanted to ask any of our advisors if there were kind of particularly interesting points or questions or comments that were brought up in your breakout rooms, if anyone would like to share those for the minute.
One thing that we discovered in our breakout session is that all of the abstracts, and this is sort of typical of abstracts, they tended to bury the lead, and then we didn't really get the so what until the very last paragraph. And that's a good way to write an abstract, but it might be, then the next revision might be to take the lead, the hook, and put it up front and put it on the top. So that happened in all three of ours, and it's very common. So the first thing I would suggest we all do is sort of find the lead and get it out front as quick as we can.
Makes sense. Any other comments that any of our advisors want to mention before we move into questions?
Yeah, I think there are two interesting things that came out of ours, which is the issue is really about interdisciplinarity and jargon. And it was very, I think, tempting for people to use a lot of jargonistic phrases to establish their expertise in something. And we talked about how with an interdisciplinary abstract, you needed to row back from that and make sure you were, if you were using a phrase that's familiar in your specialism, that you then had to make sure you were defining it. But a second thing that came up, and the attendee might say more about it, was that as I was reading through the abstracts, one of our attendees, Dina, noted that it helped to actually hear someone else reading it, because as it was being read out by me, she was beginning to rethink structure and logic and things like what Madeline was talking about with lead. And so we then had a conversation about how useful it is to actually give it to a colleague or a collaborator, but actually a non-specialist colleague, if it's interdisciplinary, is really helpful to just have the immediate response.
Definitely. We had some similar conversations in our breakout room about even reading it out loud can help you realize someone was making a comment like, oh, I realize this section feels a bit long, like maybe I could cut this. So reading it out loud to yourself, to a colleague, always useful. And we were talking a little bit about what Sam was mentioning about kind of playing around with the order of things, that if you feel like it's not flowing well, you can consider moving some really key highlights from the bottom up to the top, and playing around with things as well. Any other notes that our other leaders want to mention?
One on my end. So I've noticed that in our discussion, and then one of the things that I highlighted was the need to have an alignment between the lens that you are using, the research, the design of the study, the methods that you are using to answer the question, so that the reader is seeing a connection between how you are posing the problem, the specific insights that you are using to redefine the problem, all right, and the methods that is allowing you to present those insights, and ensuring that they are complementary and not in tension with each other. And I think that's important.
Definitely. Josh, anything you want to add on? Also, feel free. Oh dear, I don't know if we can hear you. We've had some trouble with his mic all day. If there's anything in particular, do feel free to add to the chat. But I'm not seeing any questions coming in at the moment. If anyone does have any final questions, do feel free to pop in the chat. Also, I just want to say that feel free to reach out to us afterwards. If you have any OUP specific questions, you can find Sam and my emails on the OUP website. The journal editors and section editors will also be listed on the Intersections webpage. And if you have any particular questions for them, you can find their affiliations and reach out to them as well. But I think as we're not seeing any questions coming through, we'll just end it here. But wanted to thank you all. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our attendees. It's really wonderful to have you all join us today, and to be able to feedback on. And again, if you think that your scholarship would find a good home in Oxford Intersections, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about it further. So thank you again for everything. And we look forward to speaking with you soon.